Yeah, so the recent one is I'm just starting a D4 repertoire, which will be a three-part course that is supposed to be a lifetime repertoire based on playing D4 for the first move for white. And with D4, I mean D4 is basically along with E4 tied for the most common first move, and I'm going to play it as ambitiously and ambitiously as possible. I mean, I'm going to try to fight for an advantage right from move one. I'm not going to cut any corners. There's a lot of guys out there, not so much on Chessable, but all over the place, who will recommend really lousy stuff and just say, "Oh, it's tricky, and your opponent won't be ready for it." And yeah, that's not who I am. And when I do the courses on English Reti and Sidelines or D4 Sidelines first, my goal is to put those clowns out of business. It's a very ambitious goal. It's much harder to make a lifetime repertoire from White's point of view than from Black's. But so part one that I just released covers all the sidelines, ranging from like the really ridiculous stuff, like the England gambit D4 E5, blundering a central pawn on move one. That still some people play every now and then for who knows why, but they do. So it covers some of the really ridiculous stuff like that, but it also goes pretty deep into serious lines, like as mentioned, the Benoni, the Benko, the Modern, the Dutch. For White, at least for part one, I haven't had to deal with this yet because I was dealing with sidelines, and I'm very confident I just proved an advantage against every opening I covered. But when we get to parts two and three, and we see very serious lines from Black, like the Grunfeld and the King's Indian and the Queen's Indian and various Queen's Gambits, the Semi-Slav, Semi-Tarrasch, and these are much, much tougher openings to get anywhere against. Inevitably, there's going to be a point where I'm going to have to say, here, I don't think White has enough, or here, White might be a little better. Realistically, Black's going to hold, things like that, and sort of wave the white flag and admit defeat. But what it comes down to then is understanding which positions look practically easier. And it's very easy for just about any author to say, give a bunch of moves for White and say, yeah, this position, the computer calls it equal, but I believe it's more comfortable for White. And you can say that about literally any position you want if the computer calls it equal. It's very subjective. But I'm going to really do my best to make sure when I say that, it's going to be true. And it's something that I would stand by myself. All top players will end up having to play equal positions with White now and then. That just happens. I mean, you're not going to prove an advantage all the time. But I'm going to do my best to make sure that I'm going to make Black work very hard to get there. And then I'm going to hope that when we reach this equal position objectively, it's the kind of position where Black has to be more accurate than White, where let's say, White's fourth best move will still be an equal position while Black's second best move will not. Things like this. Those are the kinds of positions that put more pressure on your opponent, and I'll work pretty hard to make that happen. I think it's very important. And even when I was like 2600, I was facing them a lot. And especially if you're playing an opening for the first time, it's very likely that if somebody prepared for you for a given game and they're expecting you to play e4 and you throw d4 at them, they may not want to just play their standard d4 repertoire. They might be scared that you prepared something specific for them, and they don't want to find out what it is, and they'll try to throw you off guard with something you haven't seen before and try to give you a sideline as a result. In general, I think you should learn the sidelines first. That's the best way to learn any opening. Make sure you're really ready to hit the ground running when the main lines come, and avoid the kind of disastrous scenarios where you spend hours upon hours upon hours learning the main line and some lazy loser plays a sideline against you you're not ready for, and they have this gleeful smile. Oh, ho, 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 my coach told me to play the sidelines because people won't be ready for them. And even though it's bad, I beat you anyway. Ho, 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 look at me. I'm so clever. Losing to people like that is just nails on a chalkboard for a real chess player. And I don't want to let that happen, and I think studying the sidelines first is a great way to avoid it. I think there are some that are totally obvious. For example, the Grunfeld is a main line, and the St. George defense is a sideline. I don't think anybody will argue that. But there are some that are sort of in the middle that you could easily make a case for either side, such as the Dutch, the Benko, the Benoni, the Modern, things like this. Basically, I sort of drew the line arbitrarily because I wanted to make the three courses approximately the same size. And I think that if I, for example, called the Benoni a main line and had to, that covers almost 10% of this course, I think, or no, it's over 10% of this course. If this course dropped under 300 trainable variations, and then the Knight F6 course, jumped over 600, I think it's better to just try to keep the courses approximately the same size. So what I said was d4, Knight F6, c4, and now e6 and g6 are main lines. Everything else is a sideline. So, for example, Old Indian, all Benonis, Benkos, things like that, I called sidelines. And then d4, d5, c4, dc4, c6, and e6 are main lines, while everything else, which could be like e5, knight c6, c5, things like that, are going to be sidelines. So basically, that's where I drew the line, but it's somewhat open to interpretation, and I think very strong players could disagree with me and do so with a straight face. Well, I try to be strategically aggressive. So this D4 course, you're very rarely going to see a position where black just gets his head torn off. In general, it's always nice when you can kill somebody straight out of the open or gets like some huge attacking position. But the better you get at chess, the less likely that is to ever happen. And I think my goal was to play very strategically aggressive chess, to force black to say, you know what, I'm going to lose the whole center or lose the bishop pair for basically nothing if I don't sort of mess the game up a little bit or mix things up or enter complications or do something, reasonably concrete. Uh, Basically, playing lines where you're strategically just better often forces your opponent into aggressive decisions. So, for example, like the Najdorf, a lot of the times, like strategically, black's just doing really well. Or even a better example would be the dragon, where black's coordination is absolutely perfect and better structure and you name it. But white, as a result, not only is the kingside attack dangerous, but he sort of has to go for it. Like I've basically never seen a serious player play against the dragon and not go after the king. Essentially, whenever you accept a position that you think is really good for you strategically, you force your opponent into action and force them to make difficult decisions. And that's my goal in this repertoire. I think there's a lot of places where if your opponent doesn't play well, he just ends up suffocating against a big center, a nice space advantage. And my goal is to force your opponent to make difficult decisions, fight for the center as early as move one. It's not to go tear their head off or give checkmate. That basically just stops working when you get good enough. And I think most Chessable audience is going to, if they're not at that point yet, they'll quickly reach it because they're getting better.